The War on Terror and the G.W. Bush Presidency. Lecture terms. The War on Terrorism. Focus question. What were the major policy elements of the War on Terror in the wake of September 11th, 2001? G.W. Bush and September 11th. Before becoming president, George W. Bush had been an oil company executive and governor of Texas. He tried to disassociate the Republican Party from anti-immigrant rhetoric of the 1990s, and he promoted what he called, quote, compassionate conservatism. His narrow margin of victory, however, did not give him a mandate to govern, and his party had only slim majorities in the House and the Senate. Yet, Bush moved quickly to implement a conservative agenda. In 2001, he pressed Congress into pressing the largest tax cut in U.S. history. And keeping with Reagan-era supply-side economics, most of the tax cuts seemed to go to the wealthy, on the assumption that they would invest their new savings in productive activity, which would increase jobs and wages for the rest of society. Bush also proposed oil drilling in a national wildlife refuge and timber harvesting in national forests to try to boost jobs. But Senator Jim Jeffords of Vermont, a moderate Republican, abandoned his party and started to vote with Democrats, making it harder for Bush to win more legislative victories. In foreign policy, Bush emphasized the need for the United States to act free of international treaties and institutions. In the 2000 campaign, he had criticized the, quote, nation building of the Clinton administration. In office, Bush announced plans to develop a national missile defense system in violation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972. And he repudiated a treaty establishing an international criminal court to try human rights violators. Also controversial was Bush's announcement that the United States would not abide by the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, which sought to fight global warming, the slow rise in Earth's temperature, which some warned could have disastrous effects on the world's climate. Bush's withdrawal from the Kyoto Protocol infuriated much of the world, but it's important to note that China also refused. September 11th transformed the international and domestic situations in Bush's presidency. Popular patriotism, not orchestrated by the government or private groups, spread through the nation as a result. Popular trust in the government rose, and public servants like firemen and police became national heroes. After 2 decades of anti-government rhetoric, the nation felt a renewed sense of common social purpose after we were attacked. The administration benefited from this, and Bush's popularity soared. Americans looked to the federal government, and especially the president, for reassurance, leadership, and action. Bush seized the opportunity and, like previous presidents, made freedom the nation's rallying cry. In an address before a joint session of Congress only a few days after September 11th, Bush said that, quote, freedom and fear are at war, and that the nation's enemies had attacked the United States because they hate our freedoms. At this speech, Bush declared a few foreign policy principles, soon known as the Bush Doctrine. The United States would launch a war on terrorism. But unlike previous wars, this war had a vaguely defined enemy: terrorist groups around the world that might threaten the United States or its allies. There also was no timetable for victory. The U.S. government would not distinguish between terrorists and the governments that harbored them, and it demanded that other nations in the world either ally with the United States or prepare for war. Bush demanded that Afghanistan, which was ruled by Islamic fundamentalists called the Taliban, surrender Osama bin Laden, who had a base in that country. When the Taliban refused, the United States, in early October 2001, launched airstrikes on their strongholds. Bush called the operation in Afghanistan Enduring Freedom. By the end of 2001, U.S. bombing and ground fighting by anti-Taliban forces drove the regime from power. A new government, friendly and dependent on the United States, took its place, repealing Taliban laws that denied women's rights to education and banned movies, music, and other aspects of Western culture. But the new government failed to fully establish control over the country. Bin Laden was not found, and Taliban supporters continued to fight the government. By early 2007, the Taliban had reasserted its power in parts of Afghanistan. The axis of evil. September 11 transformed U.S. foreign policy, inspiring policymakers to reshape the world in terms of U.S. ideals and interests. To facilitate military action in the Middle East, the United States put military bases in Central Asia, including former Soviet republics. The administration sent troops to the Philippines to help troops there fight an Islamic insurgency, and announced plans for a military presence in Africa. The United States solidified ties with the governments of Indonesia and Pakistan, which faced Islamic fundamentalist rebels. Bush said the defeat of the Taliban was only the beginning of the war on terror. In early 2002, Bush accused Iraq, Iran, and North Korea of harboring terrorists and developing weapons of mass destruction, which were nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. These kinds of weapons posed a potential threat to the United States and the world. He called these three countries an axis of evil, even though no evidence connected them with the attacks of September 11th, and they had never cooperated with one another. In September 2002, the Bush administration released a document called the National Security Strategy, marking a fundamental shift in U.S. foreign policy. The document began by defining American freedom as political democracy, freedom of expression, religious toleration, free trade, and free markets. It proclaimed that these universal ideas were, quote, right and true for every person in every society, end quote. It committed the United States to spreading freedom and its benefits by fighting terrorists and tyrants everywhere. The document insisted that to protect and extend freedom, the United States must maintain an overwhelming preponderance of military power, not allowing any other country to challenge its dominance in any region of the world. To replace the Cold War doctrine of deterrence, the National Security Strategy announced a new policy of, quote, preemptive war. If the United States believed that a nation posed a possible future threat to its security, the United States had the right to attack that nation before the threat came to reality. An American empire. Focus question: how did the war in Iraq unfold in the wake of 9/11? Confronting Iraq. The Bush administration's foreign policy statements shocked the world. Immediately after September 11th, much of the world sympathized with the United States and supported the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan as a legitimate response to the terrorist attacks of September 11th. By late 2002, however, many feared that the United States was claiming the right to act as world policeman in violation of international law. Some warned that relations between Europe and the United States were worsening because the United States was dismissing the perspectives of other nations and the United Nations. Some critics wondered if U.S. strategy was repeating the mistakes of the Cold War, and they argued that anti-Americanism was rooted not in hatred of American freedoms, but in opposition to specific U.S. policies. those toward Israel, the Palestinians, the corrupt and undemocratic regimes of the Middle East as well. The war on terror also seemed to bring the United States closer to repressive governments like Pakistan and the Republic of Central Asia. Some critics charged that the United States was bent on becoming a new global empire. September 11th showed not just U.S. vulnerability, but the nation's overwhelming strength as well, as it responded. The United States, in economic, cultural, and military terms, was far ahead of the rest of the world. Its defense budget exceeded that of the 20 next nations combined. It maintained military bases throughout the world and had a navy on every ocean. After September 11th, the world empire, once a term of abuse, came into widespread use. Some argue that the United States had to shoulder the burdens of empire, talk that worried those at home and abroad who felt the United States should not reshape the world in its own image. The Bush administration's next initiative intensified these tensions. The Iraqi dictatorship of Saddam Hussein survived its defeat in the 1991 Gulf War, and his opponents charged Hussein with developing new weapons in violation of UN resolutions. From its start, the Bush administration included a group of policymakers, including Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and Deputy Defense Secretary Paul D. Wolfowitz, all of which were determined to remove Hussein from power, seeing him as a threat to the United States and its interest in the Middle East. It was thought that Hussein could be, quote, sympathetic to terrorists bent on attacking the U.S., especially after his loss in the Gulf War to the United States. These policymakers developed a military strategy to accomplish Hussein's removal. Massive airstrikes followed by small ground invasion. They saw this as finishing the job that was left unfinished from the Gulf War. They believed Iraqis would welcome the United States Army as liberators and quickly establish a democratic government to replace Hussein, allowing the United States to withdraw its troops. Secretary of State Colin Powell, who thought the conquest and stabilization of Iraq would require hundreds of thousands of troops and should not be attempted without allies, ultimately became marginalized in this group. Though Hussein was not an Islamic fundamentalist, and no known concrete evidence linked him to the September 11th attacks, the Bush administration announced its intent to accomplish regime change in Iraq. Administration spokesmen insisted Hussein should be removed from power because he had developed an arsenal of chemical and bacterial weapons of mass destruction and was trying to acquire nuclear arms. There had been earlier evidence that he used some of these chemical weapons on some of his enemies within Iraq. The U.S. newspaper and television journalists repeated these claims without really looking into them. The UN Security Council agreed to step up weapons inspections, but the Bush administration argued that inspectors would never uncover Hussein's arsenal because he would hide them. Early in September 2003, despite misgivings, Secretary of State Colin Powell made an address to the United Nations claiming that Hussein possessed chemical weapons and was trying to acquire uranium in Africa to build nuclear weapons. Shortly after Powell's address, the President announced his intention to go to war with or without the approval of the United Nations. In response, Congress passed a resolution authorizing the President to use force in Iraq. The Iraq War. The U.S. decision to go to war split the Western alliance and inspired massive anti-war protests around the world. In February 2003, between 10 and 15 million people across the world protested imminent war. Large-scale protests in the United States brought together those who believed that a war against a nation, just because it might pose a security threat in the future, violated international law and the UN Charter. Foreign policy realists, however, warned that the administration's obsession with Iraq distracted the United States from the real foe, which was Al-Qaeda, which could still launch terror attacks, and insisted that the U.S. could not unilaterally transform the Middle East into a bastion of democracy, as the administration claimed was its long-term aim. Both traditional foes of the United States, like Russia and China, and traditional allies of the U.S., like Germany and France, refused to support a preemptive war against Iraq. Unable to get UN approval for attacking Iraq, the United States went to war in March of 2003, with Great Britain as its single significant ally. President Bush called the war Operation Iraqi Freedom, and said its goal was to defend our freedom and bring freedom to others. Hussein's government quickly fell to U.S. military forces. Hussein, after hiding for several months, was captured and put on trial. In 2006, he was found guilty of ordering the killing of many Iraqis during his rule, and then he was sentenced to death and executed. The war and the world. The war was a departure in U.S. foreign policy. The United States had intervened often in Latin America, but outside of the Western Hemisphere, it had used military force most often as part of an international coalition, like in Korea and in Vietnam. While the United States exerted much influence in the Middle East after World War II, it had never occupied a nation in the center of the world's most volatile region. Rarely in U.S. history has the country been so isolated from world opinion. In the United States, at the first instance of the war, it was popular. The administration asked no sacrifice from citizens in terms of tax increases or a draft. Many Americans believed that Hussein had something to do with September 11th and had weapons of mass destruction. And realizations that Hussein may not have those weapons ultimately discredited the rationale for the war in the coming months. Subsequent investigations showed that intelligence reports that differed from administration claims were sidetracked or ignored. The Bush administration more and more defended the war as an attempt to bring democracy to Iraq. But by early 2007, polls showed that most Americans thought the invasion was a mistake or was a lost cause. Many outside the United States now saw it as a superpower unwilling to follow international law. In 2003, a survey found that even in Western Europe, people viewed the United States as a threat to world peace. The fact that Iraq possessed the world's second largest reserves of oil reinforced beliefs that U.S. motives had more to do with self-interest than with freedom. The war strained the UN and Western alliance created after World War II. The aftermath of September 11th at home. Focus question: how did the war on terror affect the economy and American liberties? Security and liberty. The war on terrorism raised the problem of balancing security and liberty. Right after the attacks, Congress rushed to pass the USA Patriot Act, a huge bill that few members of the House or Senate actually read. It gave unprecedented powers to law enforcement agencies charged with preventing the new, vaguely defined crime of, quote, domestic terrorism. This included the power to wiretap, spy on citizens, open and read communications, and obtain personal records from third parties like universities and libraries without the suspect's knowledge. While the Bush administration discouraged anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiment, at least 5,000 foreigners with Middle Eastern connections were rounded up and 1,200 were arrested. Many people with no link to terrorism were held for months without a formal charge or public notice of their fate. The administration created a detention camp at the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for persons captured in Afghanistan or otherwise accused of terrorism, and more than 700 were detained there. In November 2001, shortly after the attacks, the Bush administration issued an executive order authorizing secret military tribunals for non-citizens deemed with assisting terrorism. In such trials, traditional constitutional protections did not apply because these were not citizens of the United States. A few months later, the Justice Department declared that American citizens could be held indefinitely without charge and not allowed to see a lawyer if the government deemed them to be, quote, enemy combatants. Attorney General John Ashcroft warned that criticism of the administration's policies aided the country's terrorist enemies. Torture controversy. In this new atmosphere of security, court orders and regulations of the 1970s, inspired by abuses of the CIA, FBI, and local police, were rescinded, allowing these agencies to resume surveillance of American citizens without evidence that a crime had been committed. Some of these measures were approved by Congress, but the President implemented many of them, claiming the authority to ignore laws that restricted his power as Commander-in-Chief during wartime. Soon after September 11th, President Bush authorized the National Security Agency to eavesdrop on American citizens' telephone conversations without a court warrant. This clearly violated laws limiting the NSA's powers. Although previous administrations had extended their power in wartime and threatened civil liberties, no other president had so dramatically asserted the power to violate long-standing constitutional principles and any law that he chose to during wartime. Most Americans seemed willing to accept the administration's belief that restraints on civil liberties were necessary to fight terrorism, although others pointed to the past and warned about dangers of surrendering liberties during war. Bush administration officials argued that the war on terror in the United States should not be bound by international law. They ignored the Geneva Conventions and International Convention Against Torture, which regulated the treatment of prisoners of war and prohibited forms of physical and mental coercion. The government, in early 2002, produced a memo stating that these rules did not apply to captured members of Al-Qaeda, since they were, quote, unlawful combatants and not members of regular armies. In early 2003, President Bush ordered that Al-Qaeda and Taliban prisoners would not have Geneva Convention protections. Later in 2003, facing protests within the administration and among military officials that this policy could provoke mistreatment of U.S. prisoners of war abroad, the President prohibited torture except when special permission was granted. Yet, the Defense Department approved interrogation methods that some observers considered bordered on torture. The CIA also set up jails in foreign countries outside of the traditional chain of military command. In such an environment, some U.S. military personnel in Afghanistan, at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, and at Guantanamo severely abused prisoners, subjecting them to shocks, attack dogs, and sexual humiliation. Some prisoners died from the maltreatment. Some U.S. personnel took photographs which were exposed in the media and undermined the reputation of the United States as a country that adheres to standards of civilized behavior and the rule of law. A few low-level soldiers were punished, and Congress banned torture in 2005 after much debate. The economy and Bush. In the 2002 congressional elections, Bush helped the Republicans win small majorities in the House and the Senate. Continuing chaos in Iraq began to undermine support for Bush's foreign policy, but the main threat to his re-election seemed to be the condition of the American economy. In 2001, the economy entered a recession. Growth resumed at the end of the year, but with business reluctant to make new investments, few jobs were actually created. The sectors that expanded the most in the 1990s contracted rapidly, and massive job cuts shook the computer, advertising, and telecommunications industries. Yet most jobs lost in 2001-2002 recession were in manufacturing. Despite renewed patriotism, deindustrialization continued, with production and factories closing in the United States and moving to Mexico, China, and India to take advantage of less taxes and cheaper labor. Even when economic recovery began, the problems of traditional industries continued. Employment in steel and auto plummeted, and major companies moved to eliminate what was left of the post-World War II social contract, in which industries had provided manufacturing workers with high wages and promises of old age support. Many employers cut or reduced pensions and health benefits for retirees. Minorities who benefited from the 1990s economic boom particularly suffered as jobs were cut. The winds of change. Focus question. What events eroded support for President Bush's policies during his second presidential term? 2004 and Bush's second term. With the jobless recovery and the Iraq War harming Bush's popularity, in 2004 the Democrats thought they could retake the White House. They nominated as their candidate John Kerry, a Massachusetts senator and decorated Vietnam combat veteran who had joined the anti-war movement. The party hoped that Kerry's military experience would deflect attacks that the Democrats were too weak to be trusted and to protect the United States from terrorism, while his anti-war credentials from the Vietnam era would appeal to those who opposed the Iraq War. But Kerry proved ineffective, lacking charisma and unable to generate enthusiasm. Kerry was unable to explain why he had voted for the war in Iraq in the Senate and then later denounced it. The mobilization of Republican conservative base by Karl Rove, Bush's chief advisor, on cultural issues, particularly the opposition to gay marriage and abortion, also weakened the Democrats. Bush only won narrowly, with a margin of 2% of the popular vote, and by only 34 electoral votes. The results revealed electoral stability, however. Both sides spent tens of millions of dollars and mobilized 20 million new voters. But in the end, only 3 states voted differently than in 2000. Although some commentators argued that the election was determined by, quote, moral values, the election was decided by the war on terror and America's interest in maintaining leadership during wartime. The Bush campaign consistently and successfully appealed to many with constant reminders of September 11th and warnings of future attacks. The Republicans also slightly increased their majorities in the House and the Senate, but the most striking feature of the congressional races was that both parties, by redrawing district lines in state legislatures, had made most seats, quote, safe. At his second inaugural, Bush promised to use American power to end, quote, tyranny in the world, and again repeatedly invoked freedom and America's mission to spread it throughout the world. Republicans were overjoyed by Bush's triumph, but continuing chaos in Iraq, coupled with corruption scandals in the Congress and the White House, eroded Bush's standing. Vice President Cheney's chief of staff was convicted of perjury in connection with an investigation of an illegal leak to the press of the name of a CIA operative whose husband had criticized the manipulation of intelligence before the Iraq invasion. Tom DeLay, the House Majority Leader, was indicted for violating campaign finance laws, and Jack Abramoff, a Republican activist and lobbyist, pleaded guilty to defrauding clients and bribing public officials. Bush's popularity declined steadily. Though Bush had Congress renew the Patriot Act with a few additional safeguards for civil liberties, the first 2 years of his second term lacked any big achievements. Though he tried to reform the Social Security system by allowing workers to set up private investment accounts, it eventually got nowhere, and Congress rejected Bush's proposals to drill for oil in an Arctic wildlife refuge and eliminate the estate tax, which affected only the richest 1% of Americans. Hurricane Katrina. The Bush administration suffered another blow in August 2005 when Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. Below sea level, between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain, New Orleans is vulnerable to flooding, and despite scientists' warnings, the levee system had not been reinforced by government officials. The levees broke when the storm hit on August 29th, and nearly the entire city, with a population of 500,000, was flooded. Nearby areas of the Louisiana and Mississippi Gulf Coast were also hard hit. This natural disaster was quickly compounded by mistakes made at all levels of government. The mayor of New Orleans had ordered evacuations too late and not provided for those unable to leave the city. The Federal Emergency Management Administration, or FEMA, now part of the Department of Homeland Security, was directed by an official with no experience in disaster management. Although warned about the storm, FEMA had done almost nothing to prepare for it. For days, thousands of people, mostly poor African Americans, were abandoned in the floodwaters. When aid started arriving, the storm had caused $80 billion in damage, killed 1,500 people, and displaced 2/3 of the city's population. The storm made Americans aware once more of the extent of poverty in the world's richest nation. Decades of state and local policies pursuing economic growth through low-wage, non-union employment and low investment in education, health, and social welfare have produced a large poor population in the South. Once a racially integrated city, New Orleans was now segregated. Blacks made up 2/3 of the city's population, which was surrounded mostly by white suburbs. While Bush declared the need to act against poverty and persistent discrimination, the Congress cut millions of dollars from Medicaid, food stamps, and other social programs to help rebuild the Gulf Coast. A year after the storm, the population of New Orleans was still only half of what it was before the storm, and reconstruction had barely begun in many neighborhoods. The storm also stopped oil production in the Gulf and increased oil prices, leading Americans to buy more fuel-efficient foreign-made cars, thus further hurting the U.S. auto industry. Immigration and Islam. In early 2006, the debate over immigration exploded. The immigration reforms of 1965 had dramatically transformed immigration patterns and especially contributed to the rapid growth of the Hispanic population. And immigration grew in the first years of the 21st century. Many new immigrants bypassed major cities and moved into small cities and towns in the Midwest, New England, and Upper South. Racial and ethnic diversity was now a fact of life in the American heartland. Undocumented newcomers, mostly from Mexico, also came to the United States. By 2005, it was estimated that 11 million illegal aliens were in the United States, with 7 million of them in the workforce. Economists disagree about their impact. While it seems clear that large numbers of uneducated and low-skilled workers push down wages at the bottom of the labor market, on the other hand, both legal and illegal immigrants receive wages, spend money, and pay taxes, and work at jobs for which American workers seem unavailable given the low wages. Some estimate that 1/5 of all construction workers, domestic workers, and agricultural workers are in the United States illegally. In 1986, the Reagan administration had granted amnesty, or the right to remain in the United States and become citizens, to 3 million illegal immigrants. In the 1990s, states with large numbers of illegal immigrants called for a crackdown on illegal immigration. By 2006, with many Americans convinced that the United States had lost control of its borders and that immigration was depressing real wages, the House of Representatives approved a bill making it a felony to be in the United States illegally and a crime to offer aid to illegal immigrants. The bill sparked a massive series of demonstrations in the spring of 2006 by hundreds of thousands of legal and illegal immigrants and their allies, demanding the right to remain in the country as citizens. The House rejected an alternative Senate bill that tightened border security but offered a path to citizenship for illegal aliens. Congress agreed only to build a 700-mile-long wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. After September 11, 2001, religious liberty in the United States came under attack from domestic pressures. 5 years before 9/11, the political scientist Samuel P. Huntington had published a widely noted book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. This book argued that a new conflict between Western and Islamic civilizations was coming to fill the void left by the end of the Cold War. Huntington's model became very popular because it was easy to digest and appeared to offer a simple explanation for the terrorist attacks. Thus, even though President Bush insisted that the war on terror was not a war against Islam, many Americans found it difficult to separate the two. Most Muslim Americans were appalled by the terror attacks. Even so, a heated debate arose over plans to build an Islamic cultural center near the site of the World Trade Center in New York City. While the city's mayor supported the project and the city approved it, as late as 2012, the construction had yet to commence. Constitution, Supreme Court, and presidential powers. As in the two previous decades, conservatives were far better at implementing their economic and foreign policy than their cultural views. Supreme Court rulings in 2003 showed how the social revolution wrought by the 1960s was not going to be undone. Ruling on challenges to the University of Michigan's admissions policy, the Supreme Court upheld the right of colleges and universities to take race into account in admissions decisions, arguing that these institutions had a legitimate interest in creating diverse student bodies to enhance education. The Bush administration had encouraged the court to reject affirmative action. In a second decision, the court struck down a Texas law that made homosexual acts a crime. The decision validated feminist and gay movements' campaigns to extend freedom into personal life, and repudiated conservative views that constitutional interpretation must rest on the Founding Fathers', quote, original intent of the document. The court also did not welcome President Bush's claim of authority to disregard laws and treaties or suspend constitutional protections of individual liberties. In a series of decisions, the court reaffirmed the rule of law both for American citizens and for foreigners imprisoned by the United States. In 2004, the court allowed a British citizen held at Guantanamo Bay to challenge his incarceration in federal court, even though he was not a U.S. citizen. It also ruled that an American citizen captured in Afghanistan and imprisoned in a military jail in South Carolina without charges or a right to see a lawyer had a right to a judicial hearing. Even the most conservative justices rejected the president's claim of authority to imprison U.S. citizens at will. Even though the court became more conservative, with President Bush's appointment of Chief Justice John Roberts and Samuel Alito, Jr., the court began and repudiated the Bush administration, this time rejecting its assumptions that the Geneva Conventions did not apply to prisoners captured in the war on terrorism, that presidents can unilaterally create secret military tribunals in which defendants have few, if any, rights, and that the Constitution did not apply at Guantanamo. In 2006, the reach of the president's powers to detain and punish suspects outside of normal legal procedures was still unclear. That year, Congress enacted a bill authorizing the establishment of a special military tribunal to try accused terrorists and giving the president authority to imprison without charge anyone he deemed an, quote, illegal enemy combatant. The law authorized harsh treatment of prisoners and allowed evidence to be used in court that had been obtained in coercive interrogations. Many military officials and lawyers objected to these provisions, fearing that captured U.S. soldiers might be subjected to the same treatment in other parts of the world as a response. Then, in 2008, for the third time in 4 years, the Supreme Court rejected the Bush administration's strategy of denying detainees at Guantanamo Bay normal protections guaranteed by the Constitution. The decision affirmed the rights of detainees to challenge their detention in U.S. courts, even though they were not U.S. citizens. Constitutional guarantees, even for non-citizens. Midterm elections of 2006. The Iraq War, the Hurricane Katrina disaster, and scandals in Congress provoked widespread public discontent in 2006. And that year, Democrats won major gains in congressional elections. Voters repudiating the administration gave Democrats control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 1994. Bush's popularity rating sank to historic lows, even though in November 2008, the United States and Iraq approved an agreement providing for the withdrawal of U.S. troops by 2011. By sending more troops to Iraq in 2007 in the surge, and by forging alliances with local tribunal leaders, the administration had reduced violence in Iraq, thus making U.S. withdrawal seem possible. When Bush left office, more than 4,000 U.S. troops had died in Iraq. In January 2009, when Bush left office, only 22% of Americans approved of his performance in office, the lowest figure since the polls began in the mid-20th century. It was difficult to see many achievements in Bush's 8 years. His foreign policy had alienated much of the world and left the United States militarily weakened and diplomatically isolated. His tax cuts for the wealthy and costs of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had transformed budget surpluses into enormous deficits, but many argued those were necessary because of the terrorist attacks on the U.S. His reforms of immigration and Social Security seemed to go nowhere, and the number of Americans living in poverty and those without health insurance rose during his term. Bubble and recession. In late 2007, the economy entered a recession. In 2008, the U.S. financial system was on the verge of total collapse and threatened to plunge the national and world economy into another Great Depression. The roots of the 2008 crisis lay in a combination of public and private policies that favored economic speculation, wild spending, and get-rich-quick schemes over more traditional paths to economic growth and advancement. Many of these were allowed over the terms of a number of different presidents, not just one. Beginning in the 1990s, the Federal Reserve had kept interest rates at very low levels to help the economy recover and to enable Americans to borrow money to buy homes. The result was a new bubble, as housing prices rose rapidly. Consumer debt rose dramatically as people who owned houses took out second mortgages or spent to the limits on their credit cards. In mid-2008, the average American family owned an enormous amount of debt. All of this borrowing fueled increased spending as Americans spent more, saved less, and saw more jobs shipped overseas, even while household incomes stagnated. China helped finance America's spending spree by buying billions of dollars of federal bonds, effectively loaning money to the United States so it could purchase Chinese-made goods. Banks and other lenders issued more and more subprime mortgages, which were risky loans to people who lacked the income to meet the monthly payments. The initially low interest rates on these loans eventually rose dramatically in a year or two, with balloon payments coming due. And banks assumed home prices would continue to rise. Wall Street bankers created complex new ways of repackaging and selling these mortgages to investors. Insurance companies, including the world's largest, American International Group, or AIG, insured these new financial products against future default. Leaving the market to regulate itself, the Federal Reserve Bank and other regulatory agencies did nothing to slow the speculative frenzy as banks and investment firms reported billions of dollars in profits and rewarded executives with bonuses. The Great Recession. By 2006 and 2007, excess housing construction caused home prices to begin to fall. As more and more homeowners defaulted or were unable to pay on their monthly mortgage payments, the value of new mortgage-based securities fell quickly. Banks suddenly found themselves with billions of dollars of worthless investments. And in 2008, the situation reached a crisis stage as banks stopped making loans. Businesses dried up, and the stock market collapsed. Some $7 trillion in shareholder wealth disappeared. Lehman Brothers, a vulnerable investment house, recorded a $2.3 billion loss and disappeared, the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. Leading banks seemed about to fail. With their home value and stocks falling, Americans reduced spending, which led to business failures and a rapid rise in unemployment. It's a vicious cycle. By the end of 2008, 2.5 million jobs had been lost, the most in any year since the end of World War II. Employment was centered in manufacturing and construction sectors dominated by men, and so in the middle of 2009, for the first time in U.S. history, more women than men in the U.S. held paying jobs, because men had lost those jobs because of the bubble burst. The gross domestic product of the United States contracted dramatically. Most damage was Americans' confidence as they lost their homes or jobs and watched their retirement savings and pensions, if invested in the stock market, completely disappear. In April 2009, the recession that started in 2007 became the longest since the Great Depression. In an era of globalization, economic crisis spread across the world, causing higher unemployment and economic collapse in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. In The Wealth of Nations from 1776, Adam Smith wrote, quote, "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public." End quote. This seemed to describe the behavior of leading bankers and investment houses whose greed helped to bring down the U.S. economy. Like others before, scandals damaged confidence in the ethics of corporate leaders and seemed to repeat the get-rich-quick ethos. Connection between business and government, passion for deregulation, and corruption that had contributed to earlier economic crises. Public anger at bankers and stockbrokers skyrocketed as Wall Street firms fired thousands of employees, but paid out $20 billion in bonuses to top executives. Economic crisis looms. The crisis showed the dark side of market fundamentalism, the ethos of deregulation that dominated world affairs in recent decades. Alan Greenspan, chair of the Federal Reserve Bank from 1987 to 2006, had steered the U.S. economy through multiple crises and presided over much deregulation, artificially low interest rates, and excessive borrowing and spending. He and his successors had promoted the housing bubble and allowed speculation to flourish without government intervention, effectively allowing securities firms to regulate themselves. In 2008, Greenspan conceded to Congress that there had been a, quote, flaw in his belief that free markets automatically produce the best results for all, that regulation would damage banks, Wall Street, and the mortgage market. And he said that he was, quote, shocked by the crisis. His testimony seemed to mark an end of an era in which every president from Reagan onward had told the world to adopt the U.S. model of unregulated economic competition, or laissez-faire. Now the U.S. model lay in ruins, and a new role for government in regulating the economy seemed inevitable. In the fall of 2008, the Bush administration seemed unable to address the crisis. Sticking to free market principles, it allowed Lehman Brothers to fail. But this sent stock prices of other banks and investment houses into a free fall. The administration quickly reversed course. It persuaded Congress to appropriate $700 billion to bail out failing firms. Insurance companies like AIG, banks like Citigroup and Bank of America, and giant financial companies like the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation and the Federal National Mortgage Association, properly known as Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, respectively, which insured most mortgages in the country, were deemed, quote, too big to fail. They were so interconnected with other institutions that their failure would cause a depression, it was argued. Through the federal bailout, taxpayers, in effect, took temporary ownership of these companies, absorbing their massive losses. But bailout funds were distributed with no requirements about their use. Few of the rescued firms used public funds to assist homeowners, and giant banks and investment houses redirected some of the public funds to enormous bonuses for their top employees instead. Despite this bailout, the banking system's health was still fragile, as firms' balance sheets had billions of dollars in worthless loans. The crisis also exposed the paucity of the U.S. safety net compared with other industrialized nations. In Western Europe, laid-off workers received many months of unemployment insurance. In the United States, only a third of the jobless even qualified for unemployment insurance, which ran out for most in a few months. The abolition of, quote, welfare during the Clinton administration left only a patchwork of national aid programs, like food stamps, for the newly poor, and state funds for poor relief were quickly exhausted as tax revenues disappeared.